everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Oren Siegel, Vice President of the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League. Oren, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
It's been a really tough week, a horrific incident in D.C. this week. A young couple, a Jewish American woman and an Israeli man, were shot to death outside of an event hosted by the American Jewish Committee at the Capitol Jewish Museum. To start off the conversation, what is your reaction to what happened earlier this week?
Yeah, the Jewish community has been through this before, right? A violent tragedy that impacts really everybody. And the first thing is our hearts are with the families of the victims. But once the initial shock wears off, you realize that there have been a lot of factors that were almost leading to this moment that I believe made this moment possible.
Can you talk about that? What are those factors that you think made this moment possible?
When you look at the alleged shooter and some of the organizations that he had been involved with, protest organizations, they weren't organizations that merely focused on criticism of Israeli policy, right? There's nothing wrong with criticizing the policies of a government. These were organizations that, in some cases, had events that glorified, violent resistance against Israelis, that legitimized those types of more militant positions. And that in some cases, we've also seen just in the broader movement, especially since October 7th, this ability to conflate, opposition to the state of Israel and ascribe that onto all the Jewish people.
And you saw that in this instance. As you said, there's nothing wrong with criticizing a government, but we've recently seen an uptick in international criticisms of Israel. But what do you say to those attempting to justify or explain the motivation behind this attack by tying it somehow to Israel's policies and what they're doing in Gaza?
Right. The person that kind of ties this to the Israel issue is the shooter himself. Right. There was a manifesto that was left behind in which he talks about, that nonviolence hasn't done enough in the manifesto, which I'm not going to, cite chapter and verse, but essentially identifies this person's massive concerns with, the state of Israel and those that he views as abetting the state of Israel. And so, again, when you're in an environment where people are glorifying violence and the terrorist organizations responsible for it and are dehumanizing Zionists and the Jewish people, tragedies like this are not far behind.
And I want to talk a little bit about the framing of this story because I've seen this criticism before. I've also seen it from the ADL where it seems like there was an issue with framing it as the victims were staffers at the Israeli embassy. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we know. Anybody knows yet, if these people were targeted because of who they were, as if he knew them. It seems like we know that this person was targeting the Capitol Jewish Museum, right? And so I think when you are targeting the Capitol Jewish Museum because of your apparent concern about the Palestinians, this is somebody who literally yelled "Free Palestine," as part of this attack. That, again, is ascribing blame on the entire Jewish community for what the state of Israel does. That is not only classic anti-Semitism, but when you kill people for political purposes, that's terrorism.
And we have been seeing anti-Semitism not only in this country but globally on the rise since October 7th and even before then. And I think it's obviously not enough just to combat anti-Semitism when we see it, but to root it out. So do you think that the Trump administration is doing enough not to only combat this, but to root it out? What do you make of their response?
Yeah, I think, to truly, prevent the next anti-Semitic attack from happening or the normalization of anti-Semitism, you need people across the spectrum to be fighting this, right? So that requires social media companies to stop enabling their exploitation of their platforms to spread it. That means you need government agencies to take it seriously. Listen, a lot of people have been concerned about the rhetoric and the violence and the treatment of students on campus. For a long time. The administration has taken some steps to do that. I think what is important, though, is also not to politicize anti-Semitism, right? So if you're going to fight anti-Semitism directly, whether it's on campus or not, having governments and institutions support that is very important. But that needs to stay focused on anti-Semitism and not to try to, create other political opportunities out of that fight.
And I know you think that anti-Semitism should not be politicized, but what do you make of each party's response to this incident? I mean, do you think in this country at large, Democrats are doing enough to combat and root out anti-Semitism, and Republicans are doing enough to combat and root out anti-Semitism?
I mean, I'll just say I don't think anybody's doing enough, right? I mean, if enough was being done, we wouldn't have had the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents since we started recording this 46 years ago in 2024, right? If we were doing enough collectively, we wouldn't have as many violent incidents as we have. So I think it's also a question of, it's not just winning hearts and minds. And it's not that anti-Semitism alone is so terrible, because it is. It's the inability to recognize anti-Semitism that I think ultimately may be a longer lasting danger. When people don't even know what they're doing or what they're saying or what they're advocating for has an impact on the Jewish community that is negative, I think that's ultimately the greatest danger.
And how do you think then we can open people's eyes to call out anti-Semitism? Because that inability to even recognize anti-Semitism, I mean, A, that's really scary, and B, I think that's step one in this whole process.
It's a great question. How do we get people to see it, to speak out against it once they do? I do think this is a battle of hearts and minds. And, you think about where people are getting their worldview, especially a younger audience where, some surveys have shown maybe tend to embrace a certain amount of anti-Semitism more than others. I mean, you have to reach them where they're at. That doesn't mean, a political press conference. That doesn't mean, the nightly news, and it doesn't mean necessarily the spaces that they are not in, right? So messaging from influencers, using technology to help them understand, I think is ultimately where we need to be. But how do you create authentic messages that will balance out just the massive amount of conspiracy theories and disinformation online is also a challenge in itself. But I will tell you that what people find and hear and learn online certainly animates them to action in the real world. And I think maybe, just maybe, we will see how that may have been the case in this attack as well.
And AG Pam Bondi, she didn't mince words here. She said if charged, the defendant would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The death penalty is not on the table, or it's not off the table, rather, here. What do you think is next for this? Do you think that's enough? I mean, what do you make of the administration's response in that regard?
I mean, this accountability really is important for people who engage in such hate crimes or terrorism or targeting communities, right? So having holding them accountable for what they're doing, whatever that means for that community that is impacted, I think is important. I actually think that in a time where we're seeing a lot of lack of accountability in what people are saying and what we're seeing allowed online, right? In the language that we're seeing in the street and how that animates people to action. It's good to feel. It's good to know. I know the Jewish community feels better when we hear leaders who are going to take a strong stance against pushing back against that anti-Semitism and holding people accountable.
Well, Oren, I really appreciate you coming on today. My thoughts are with you and the Jewish community this week. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.